My name is Janae. I am the Carroll County Conservation District Manager. She's not here at the moment, but for COAS, Carly Lohenmeyer was theirs when we started putting this together. And then Grafton County, their district manager is Laura Sokolowski, and she's here. If you want to introduce herself, you can.
Sure. So I'm Laura Sokolowski. I'm the Grafton County Conservation District Manager. I'll be managing the chat tonight. So if you have questions, please put them there and we'll be going over them in the Q&A. And if you have any questions about the Conservation District in general, I'm always happy to answer them in the future.
Perfect. We have two speakers with us tonight. We have Pollyanna Fisher from the Squam Lakes Association, and then we have Mike Gagnon from the UNH Cooperative Extension as a forestry field specialist. And with that, I will turn it over to Pollyanna so she can begin.
Thank you. And I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right. So thank you so much for having me from talk about aquatic invasive species and milfoil management. I work at the Squam Lakes Association here in Holderness. And so I wanted to start off by giving a blanket definition of invasive species. So an invasive species is a non-native organism. It can be a plant, an animal, a microorganism that's introduced to a new ecosystem and it spreads aggressively and causes an economic, environmental, or health harm, and it outcompetes native species, disrupting habitats and reducing biodiversity. It disrupts the ecosystem balance, and they thrive by outcompeting native species for resources, bringing new diseases, or directly preying on them. Sorry, I just realized I'm not sharing the page I want. Um, so they disrupt the ecosystem balance and they outcompete native species. They bring on new diseases and they prey on them, and they have often devastating effects on biodiversity. Um, In this presentation, I will give an overview of aquatic invasive species in New Hampshire and focus on SLA's work to remove milfoil at Squam Lakes. So I'm going to start with some species that we see that are land species, but they also move toward the lake. So purple loosestrife thrives in wet areas, so you can find it in ditches and wet meadows and marshes and along shorelines. It is native to Europe and temperate Asia, Northern Africa, and Australia, and it ranges from damp to dry conditions. Um, the issue with many of these species is that when any of us tries to remove it, like this beautiful little plant, it would be very easy for me to think, oh, I can just pull it from the root and I'll get rid of it. But the thing is that all these little flowers can disperse these tiny, tiny seeds. One single plant can have up to 2.7 million seeds that are carried away by wind and water. So a lot of training and care is needed when removing or disposing of these invasive species. Another species that I'm not going to get into, but I wanted to mention because it's important to keep an eye out for them, is Phragmites, or the common reed. Again, it's like the loosestrife found on moist roadsides and just shoreline areas. This is variable milfoil. This is the main species of concern for many of our lakes, including Squam Lake. It is native to the southern and central US, and it has been found in over 70, actually 75 water bodies in New Hampshire. It presents thick whorls of leaves along the entire stem with a squirrel-like tail appearance, and I'll show other photos where you can see it in the water environment. I will also share the native species. So we have the northern water milfoil, which is our native species. It's similar, however, if you tell them apart, you would cut a cross section, and you can see one of these cross sections next to each plant. So variable milfoil, the invasive one, has 5 points to it, so 5 little feather-like leaves that come off of that main stem, while the native one only has 4, and they're not quite as bushy, and it's a little bit more delicate looking as well. So this is a picture of milfoil underwater. They create dense mats, and they block sunlight and deplete oxygen from the ecosystems. It crowd out native plants, and it can change the water chemistry. It also restricts recreation like boating and swimming, and it damages property values. And it spreads easily through fragments, making it very hard to control. Also, when it's being removed, if any of the roots are left in the soil, they will reproduce from that. So this is another milfoil, which is also invasive in New Hampshire. It's the Eurasian milfoil, and its leaves have more of a feather-like appearance than the native milfoil, and it also has a reddish stem. Now the next few slides will be other plants to keep an eye out for and just be aware of. We don't have this at Squam Lake, but it is in other places in the state. This is fanwort. It is native to Europe and Asia, and it forms dense mats similar to milfoil, but it's characterized by bright green color with opposite fan-shaped leaves. It produces a small white lily-like flower and floats on the surface late in summer. Another invasive species that is native to Europe and Asia is a curly leaf pondweed. It is compared to kind of like a lasagna-like leaf, long and skinny though, and it also forms dense mats early in the season, and it releases dormant buds that spread invasively, requiring all boat and gear to be cleaned. And there's quite extensive management efforts in some of our lakes, including Sunapee and Winnipesaukee. And then these are some of some crustaceans that are found in our lakes. There's the Asian clam, the zebra mussel, and the Chinese mystery snail. Many of these get introduced to waterways through ballast waters and live wells. The Asian clam is roughly the diameter of a dime and sometimes larger. It is ridged brownish shells, and they can clog waterways. They alter nutrient cycles and outcompete native species. It forms dense colonies in the soil, outcompeting other species, and it's very uncomfortable to walk around in the shallow areas when you have a big colony of these. Zebra mussels, they're roughly the size of a pistachio nut, and they'll stick to surfaces like boat hulls, docks, and pipes. And Chinese mystery snail is an aquarium species that was introduced to New Hampshire, and it currently affects over 80 water bodies in New Hampshire. All these species outcompete native species, and they disrupt food webs, and they can also clog intake pipes. And this is our next big threat to all of our lakes. The spiny water flea is native to Northern Europe and Asia. It predates on native zooplankton, and it's causing its decline in the water bodies where it is found. We've found that it prefers cold temperatures, but it can tolerate both brackish and warm water. And it was first observed in Winnipesaukee and Winnisquam in 2023. Sadly, last year it was confirmed to be seen in Newfound Lake. And this is a difficult species because, as you can see from this photo, I mean, they're 15 millimeters long, and they're just tiny and they're see-through. If you look at it in a glass of water, they're very difficult to discern. You can just see that big black eye. And it's often transported from water bodies through fishing gear. And their eggs and larvae have a long time where they can survive being desiccated or out of water. They usually lay their eggs. These eggs will overwinter and then hatch in the spring. Um, so, like I said, they attach themselves to fishing gear, recreational boats, and bait buckets. Those long little spiny tails are made out of silica and they can harm fish when they're ingested. They can get stuck in their tracheas. They can also puncture um, organs. They're just not fun. And they eat the other plankton. So they cause a decline in the food web for our native species. So the main prevention method to not introduce this to our waterways is the clean, drain, dry protocol. So you've got to thoroughly clean your boats, drain all the water, dry equipment, and I think best would be to use hot water to just wash things off. So, and properly dispose of bait to stop their spread. They are not a fun species, but it is going to be a difficult one to maintain out of our waterways. So this is Squam Lake. I hope many of you are familiar with Squam Lake. If not, come to the SLA and you will have access to visit it. We have canoes and kayaks for the summer. We will have Winterfest on February 14th, so come enjoy ice skating and learn about water quality in the winter. That's my little pitch. But these are the two invasive species that we currently have on Squam Lake and Little Squam. And next I will discuss methods that we are using to tackle them. So for variable milfoil, the main control methods are benthic barriers. These are, in that first picture that you see there, these are large mats that get lodged on the bottom, on top of the plants. And they are most effective when they're left in place for 4 weeks. They will then smother the milfoil, but they'll still allow the native vegetation to regenerate once they're removed. Another method is chemical treatment. So herbicides can be effective in well-controlled areas, but they can cause harm to non-target species like other plants and invertebrates, and it can have inconsistent results depending on application and weather conditions. So chemical treatments are one of a last resort option, and they need state permits, and they can be only applied by professionals. But there are areas where the milfoil and all these other plants can be so dense that that might be the one option, or at least an option to get it to die back and use other methods to further control it. There's also habitat manipulation, so that involves drawing water from the lakes or ponds to allow for plants to dry out. A lot of times, a lot of our lakes do this in the fall. They'll let more water out, and then these plants that form in the shorelines will dry out, and hopefully that's a way to kill them off. And lastly, there's mechanical. So there's hand pulling and dash. We do both of those at the Squam Lakes Association. Depending on the area and the type of infestation is the type of method that is chosen. Hand pulling is pretty self-explanatory. However, you've got to have proper training and be very careful. As mentioned before, milfoil breaks off really easily and it can spread by fragmentation. So any little piece that is left floating will lay roots and create a beautiful new plant somewhere else. The diver assisted suction harvesting, or DASH, needs to be done by specially trained individuals, and I'll discuss that in a second. Oh, sorry, that was an image of the chemical treatment. Another note about chemical treatment is when I was reading about these studies is that areas that are treated are then there is, well, you have to stay out of the water for a certain amount of time, and usually it's up to a week, and then the water needs to be tested to make sure that it's safe for human use. This is Millie, our DASH system that was generously provided by a moose grant, a moose plate grant, and we've had Millie for a couple of years. We had other systems before that, but these systems are used a lot during the summer. So our SLA dive team goes through the state required aquatic weed control training, and they become very well versed in identifying, documenting, and the safe, effective harvesting and disposal techniques for invasive species. You can also see there's a kayak, so that is used for a dive tender that will go out on dive days. The dive tender is there for safety, and they also pick up any fragments that might float away from the divers. This is a picture of the top side. We've got our AmeriCorps, part of our AmeriCorps team here from a couple of years. They are sifting through the milfoil that has been pulled up by this harvesting system, and they are looking for any native plants or native invertebrates that will be returned to the lake. So this graph shows the wet weight of variable milfoil removed by hand pulling and dash divers per year. Our milfoil efforts started, I want to say in 2004. I would have to really go back, but at least this data shows from 2012 up to now. Now, this is a little misleading because it doesn't show the sites that have had all the milfoil removed. So there are some sites on the lake that might have had a couple of plants where milfoil was removed, and we just go back and double check that there isn't any milfoil coming back. And so at Squam, we have effectively corralled milfoil to just certain areas, and this is where a lot of this plant material comes from. So going back to 2012 all the way to 2018, there is a slight downward trend. The blue is Squam River, where it's just an uphill battle that's where there's a lot of milfoil, and we're always trying to remove it. Little Squam and Squam Lake are in orange and green. And so, as I mentioned, there is a bit of a downward trend going from 2012 to 2018. And then we have this, oh wait, this is 2025. I didn't have time to include it per area, but as you can see, we've got up to 4,000 gallons. And then as I was going to 2019, 2020, and 2021, there is a decrease in variable milfoil removal. And it's not necessarily that those years there wasn't a lot of milfoil. It was that our dive team, due to various reasons, our dive team was not in the water that much. So there was COVID, which restricted a lot of our efforts. But as our dive team has kind of gotten back on its feet or back in the water, um, our numbers have gone up again. And 2025, there's a couple of explanations as to why we were able to get more than 4,000 gallons of milfoil. And not only is it because we did have a great dive team this year, our AmeriCorps crew worked very hard, but the changing environmental factors have allowed for the growth season of milfoil to be longer. What that means is that our winters, even though this winter has been quite cold and we've had quite a bit of snow and ice, early ice, and last winter I think was pretty cold too, but leading up to these to now, we have seen a trend of shorter winters with less ice and snow, and longer summers, longer, warmer summers with less rain, cloud cover, and also longer fall seasons. So what that means is that we have a longer growth season for milfoil, and areas where we would typically in the fall see a dieback or that we had already gotten most of the plants, we see that there's regrowth. So we have to hit those sites harder and more times to try to get rid of the biomass.
Okay, and
As
we're
an
getting
example,
down to the last minute. So
oh,
just as a
okay,
time
well,
check, any last minute things you want to share?
yeah. Um, all right. So just real quick, invasive species are very costly. Just in the recent years, DES has awarded up to $500,000 in just to remove invasive species and for education. We run our program with a very small grant. It's a match grant, and that doesn't include all the time we spend in training and staffing. Um, so prevention is the best measure. We have the Lake Coast program, clean, drain, dry, and never dump your live bait or aquarium species. And lastly, what can you do? If you see an invasive, what you think might be something you don't know, what might be an invasive species, take a picture, take a sample, put it in your fridge, and call DES, send them an email. They are great. Um, and with that, thank you so much. Uh, do you want to give it to the next host?
Yeah, it'll move on to Mike now.
Okay.
While Mike is setting up, thank you for all the questions in the chat. We're going to have a Q&A at the end. So keep them coming if you have any more. And just thank you so much, Pollyanna and the Squam Lakes Association.
Okay. How does that look? Do you see a presenter view or a slideshow?
Presenter view.
Presenter view. How about now?
Oh, there we go.
That looks correct. Okay, thank you. All right, folks. Thanks. Happy to be here. We've come to the sort of and more part of the presentation and moving from the aquatics, which we just heard about, into a little bit of the upland stuff. So some similar messaging, invasive plants, a lot of similar issues. And we'll do a little bit of background about some invasives, and then we'll dive in a little bit into some options for these specific species. This is a really big topic, invasive, so I like how these seminars are broken into pieces. It's good to take bites, and I think it's good to like think about things a little bit at a time, but in detail. So I'm an extension forester in Hillsborough County. I'm down south. I know this is northern counties, and but there's a county forester or an extension forester in each county that can walk your land with you and help you identify and manage your forest resources. And a big part of that is usually getting familiar with what invasive plants are posing a threat. So our first talk, we talked about some of the problems invasives cause, one of the first slides from Pollyanna. And this is a good pairing to that, because this is like, why are these plants causing so many problems, right? So they have a lot of common traits they share. Many of them produce many offspring, and they do it quickly, right? So invasive plants, to be called an invasive plant, also need to be a non-native plant. And when we make a policy decision, it's a non-native plant that causes a human health problem, an environmental problem, or an economic problem. And then we sort of term them as invasive species when we recognize them. So another trait is long-term seed viability, right? We talked about plants adapting to or becoming more problems with climate patterns and extended growing seasons. And many of our invasive plants already have an advantage of an extended leaf phenology, meaning they're greening up earlier in the year and staying green longer. So they have an advantage. And as climate patterns change, that advantage might increase. They often disperse easily, right? We saw that in the first talk, and many of them have not just seeds, but propagules where they can sort of clone themselves and easily and rapidly disperse and colonize new areas. A lot of invasive plants are really tolerant of a lot of different growing conditions too, and disturbed sites. And we're pretty good at disturbing sites and creating those conditions, road edges, field edges. And a lot of times in my world, we disturb forests on purpose, but you might get unintended consequences. So, and a big one is fewer enemies. These plants have moved from one place, on the planet to a new one, and they've escaped pathogens and herbivores. So some studies have shown, up to an 80%, 84% decrease in fungal pathogens impacting invasive plants in a new environment. So a big advantage when things aren't limiting you. And when we look at invasives, they all sort of follow this similar pattern. It's sort of this exponential growth, over time. Area infested rapidly increases. And with that comes some realities about how we might manage them and the costs or energy we have to input to control them, to manage our environments. So we always want to be preventing, right? And that a lot of that has to do with education and awareness. And we always want to stay sort of in that lower part of the curve whenever possible. So we call that early detection, rapid response, right? So control here, and we can have really good, successful impacts. And when we get up here, unfortunately, this is kind of where public awareness kicks in, where we see the bittersweet hanging off of everything, and it's been there a while. Our management options might be different. We might not be eradicating a plant, but thinking about how we're sort of restoring or managing the goals we have for a certain area without maybe eradicating, but minimizing the impacts of invasive plants. So just a few more big picture considerations. We really, when you're looking at a site, I mean, early detection can be statewide, or it can be your little piece of the world, right? It could be, the 2 acres that I live on, or your 40-acre woodlot, or the northern, your northern counties. You want to really monitor and understand what invasives are a problem, and what's that scale, acreages, stem break, or right, how much is there, how big are they, how advanced are they? We want to always think about integrated vegetation management. That's using all of the tools possible, chemicals, mechanical, cultural, right? Our behavior, manipulating the environment. And that box is on top. And we want to think about the costs and labor involved for different options, and really want to really think long term about when we're managing invasives, because we can spend a lot of time and energy, but if we don't really think long term and commit to a long-term strategy, it may not be worth investing that initial energy or effort, right? Because it's something that needs to be continued on any given site when invasives are present. And so really great resources, this book you can get, and the website's there. It was blocking one of my bullets, but Picking Our Battles, this is a really good resource that can guide the planning for successful invasive plant management projects. It can be found on the New Hampshire Fish and Game website. And so I already mentioned this, but really with any plant, whether it's milfoil or buckthorn, we want to think about IVM, or integrated vegetation management. We want to use whatever tools possible to get the best result, and always try to be minimizing the chemical aspect of it, right? Mechanical, cutting, mowing, sometimes that can make things worse, but pairing it with chemical can be a really efficient strategy, right? And cultural, to me, is awareness, right? Understanding what plants are in the areas we're managing, being sensitive to native plants, and understanding the plants that we're dealing with, right? So identifying the problem. These plants all have these common traits, but they all have certain things that might limit them as well, like shade or soil moisture or things like that. So it takes you really want to know the enemy of these plants and understand how the things you do might make things worse or better, depending on how their physical, biological strategies are for reproducing, right? Like the loosestrife, when you can identify it and pull it, you're spreading the seed. So timing is also pretty important when it comes to these different approaches. We're going to talk about a few different chemical control methods with the plants, the 3 different plants tonight. But just some basic ones: our foliar, low volume backpack or handheld sprayers, targeted applications are a common tool used for managing invasives. Cut stump, right? Just like it sounds, you cut something and then you apply an herbicide to the stump. You can see it's got a dye on it here, and you only need to apply it to the sapwood, the living portion of the wood. The center is not really transporting or translocating any material. You can see the color there in that one. So just applying it to the outside edge is enough. And then sometimes basal bark is used, but that needs a sort of a penetrating oil where you put an herbicide on the lower maybe foot of a stem and allow it just to move through the bark and into the plant. Somebody needs to, okay. So some general considerations for foliar applications. There's really no single ingredient that works well against all plants in our area.
He's giving a talk.
There are two main herbicides that are used, glyphosate and triclopyr. Glyphosate is a non-selective herbicide, and triclopyr is selective. And what that means is glyphosate is non-selective. It'll be effective on sort of any leaf green photosynthetic material it comes in contact with, more or less. And triclopyr is selective in that it doesn't impact things like grasses or lilies, things like that. So, but these are usually the two main tools in the toolbox when it comes to using an herbicide. Timing is really important. We use the phenology of the plant, or the physiology rather. In midsummer to fall, plants are starting to move carbohydrates and material into the roots, and that's how we want control. If we do something early in the year, we may think we've made an impact. That plant might turn brown, but then it might green up because all that energy, those arrows you see, are pointing the other way earlier in the year, and all the energy is coming up. So we're not using the plant to move the material down to our advantage. And generally, if it's not included in the product, the surfactant is needed, and that's it's like a soap, something that allows the cuticle of the leaf surface to break down, and the water to disperse sort of evenly across the surface and more effectively get into the plant. But we'll just talk about 3 different plants here real quick. Glossy buckthorn. This one's kind of sneaky in that it doesn't jump out at you like knotweed or bittersweet vines, but when you start to see it, it becomes less sneaky when you see thousands and thousands of it. It's a shrub, it's perennial. It can become somewhat of a small tree, with a 6-inch stem and 20 feet tall. It has the bark is sort of gray with white lenticels. I don't have a photo, but if you cut into these, they have an inner bark that's orange. The twigs have the lenticels are the little here we go, little like white dots or lines on the young twigs, and they actually go the same direction as the stem, which is something I use as a feature for identifying glossy buckthorn. Habitat for this one's really variable, so it can be a real problem in forests. It can handle wet soils and dry soils and full sun to shade. Seeds are dispersed by birds, and they can sit in like low light conditions and wait for disturbance, and then rapidly sort of increase in numbers, creating a fast growing dense canopy that can shade out natives. A couple other things about glossy buckthorn: it has these naked buds, which are like little fuzzy leaves that are covering the bud material in that center picture. You can see the little vertical lines on the twig, the lenticels. They're actually dashed in the same direction of the twig in the middle. On the left, it gets kind of a distinct lenticel pattern when it's older. You start to recognize that, just this white flecking in the bark. And on the right, the leaves have no teeth, so they're egg-shaped. And the veins actually don't go out to the edge of the leaf, they curve around. You can see a vein. It doesn't quite go out right to the margin. It goes out towards it, and then it curls around and follows the edge of the leaf around. And so this can be a problem when you're trying to manage a forest, because you can end up with this kind of a condition where you have maybe old field pine that you might want to manage or remove, and behind it, what's creeped up under is a dense canopy of buckthorn. And then after harvest, after disturbance, when you have seeds and seedlings present in low numbers, they can rapidly increase. So a couple options: glossy buckthorn, just for control options, a basal bark application, which is that coating the lower stems of the leaf. You could use a 20% triclopyr ester. If there are not a lot of stems, then they're smaller stems. Research shown that you can even go as low as 5% on that, and it can be effective. It's just going to take a little longer to show mortality. You can also do a cut and apply glyphosate or triclopyr to the stump. So we call that cut stem. It can be really effective, but it's there's a little bit more work involved, right? When you have potentially maybe thousands of stems to be treating. And then you can use that IVM and cut and allow to resprout and then do a foliar application. That can reduce the amount of vegetation. You know, you take those tall plants and make them short and weaken them with a mechanical approach, and then apply an herbicide after they've resprouted. Although cutting alone makes things worse, glossy buckthorn develops very strong root systems and becomes multi-stem the more you cut it. This is a really neat tool if anybody's ever heard of it. It's called the Buckthorn Blaster. This is for cut stem applications. It's just like a little bingo dauber that you can buy, and it's really small. You can keep it in your pocket. You know, a pair of hand pruners and one of these, and you can do a lot of effective control of woody invasive shrubs that you're trying to manage. Another one that's kind of an early detection for the north is pretty common in New Hampshire, but not as common in the North Country. So it's listed as a sort of an early detection up for North Country, is autumn olive. This one's a little different than buckthorn in that it requires more sun. So we don't see it in overtaking forest understories, but we see it overtaking field sites and field edges and things like that. So autumn olive, it has very distinct light color undersides of the leaves, and sort of a perennial deciduous shrub. It can get up to about 20 feet tall, multiple stems. It has these longer elliptical leaves, solitary white flowers. They're kind of pretty. It has a drupe for a fruit, which has a drupe is like a berry with a hard pit. It naturalizes in open spaces and does really well exposed to sun and on very poor sites. It's rapidly consumed by birds and wildlife, so that's how it's dispersed. And it is a nitrogen fixer, so I see autumn olive becoming a particular problem on sites that maybe that are degraded, that have really poor low nutrients, or maybe someone's taken the topsoil off an area and it's got low nutrients, so this plant can get its nitrogen out of the atmosphere.
Hello. I'm so sorry, but this is just a time check.
Okay.
If there's anything else that you'd like to share before we launch into the Q&A.
Yeah, well, I had some bittersweet slides, but you guys are talking about bittersweet next week, so I can easily just cover these two plants. Do a couple more photos. This is kind of autumn olive. It's very easy to identify because of the light leaves and the light twigs. And so I get used to seeing just the silvery light color from afar, even in winter or in summer, because of the undersides of the leaves or the young twigs. It does have these really sharp, spiny thorns. Here's some more pictures. You can see a little bit of the underside of the leaves in one of the middle pictures there, very light, silvery color. And when you look really close, it looks like somebody has spritzed the buds and twigs with almost like a copper paint. It's kind of distinct, so that really helps me ID it as well. You know, when things don't have leaves, it's a little harder to ID them. So for autumn olive, I'll just do the control here. So glyphosate alone is not a great tool for this one because it just rapidly resprouts. So depending on what you're doing, it's not a great tool. So for small stems, you can pull by hand, or you can do a foliar application of the triclopyr, or a mix of triclopyr and glyphosate. For larger stems, you can do a cut stump application, or you can do a basal bark. It's really effective because autumn olive has very thin bark. So those are some good tools. And so here's a little decision matrix. If autumn olive is a problem, shrubs are small enough to pull by hand, chemical control is not desirable, you can hand pull. If you wanted to use chemical option, you can use a really low concentration, 2% triclopyramine plus a surfactant. And if the shrubs are too big to pull, you can do the cut stump, or you could do a basal bark as well. And you could do this with triclopyr or glyphosate if it's cut stump. So there's a lot to talk about, and I'm happy to people through email if they want more information on these things. But I just would like to say that I was talking about some chemical options. Anybody can use general use products on their own property as long as you're following all the rules and setbacks. And the label is considered a legal document that needs to be followed under federal law. So if you're following the label and you're on your own land using general use products, and you can use them safely. But once we go onto someone else's land, whether it's for money or not, we're required to be a licensed applicator in New Hampshire. And so there are ways to become licensed applicators. If you were, say, a Conservation Commission member, you could become a not for hire, which means you would get a supervisory license after taking some classes and tests, and then you could only work on town lands, something like that. So you can get more information here in these slides, and wrap it up there. And I'll be back in a couple of weeks. We'll talk just about knotweed.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So sorry to cut you short because there's so much to share. But we do have some questions.
Yeah, no, it's a challenge to talk about invasives because we can talk about this for 8 hours and we'd still be like scratching the surface. It's a big topic, so yeah.
So we have one question for the Squam Lakes Association, which is, for milfoil, how is removed biomass disposed of?
Oh, yes, great question. We have a composting area which is well away from the lake and any tributaries. So all that is composted and later used for our on-site housing gardens.
Wonderful. We also have one for UNH, which is, does posting on iNaturalist or other types of plant identification apps help with invasive plant data records?
Great question. That helps, but there's a tool called EDMAPS, Early Detection Distribution Mapping System, and that's what the state of New Hampshire uses for mapping invasive species. So EDDMAPS. And you can create your own profile on there, and then you can upload photos and document something you found. It's especially important for uncommon things or early detection. And then those go to Doug Sagan. He's the state invasive species coordinator. He will confirm that it's correct and make it public record. And it might actually trigger a response if it's something like kudzu, which doesn't exist in New Hampshire. And if you were to find that and log it, there would be boots on the ground to try to deal with that issue. So EDMAPS.
We might have to include the link for that later. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I can find it and put it in the chat.
Another one is, what does it stand for?
So that is the diver assisted suction harvesting, and it is so that the Millie boat that I showed you guys, it's got this big suction hose that the diver takes down to the bottom, and they very gently feed in the whole plant from the top, and then they'll try to gently remove the roots and feed it all in. So diver assisted suction harvesting.
I love that it's called Millie. Very well done. Another one for either of you if you want to take a stab at it. I know that parts of this have been addressed, but since most of these invasive species have aggressive growth patterns, Why do they not cause problems in their native habitats, and what do their native habitats have to keep them in check?
I'm happy to take a stab and maybe Mike can add to it. So native habitats will have native predators. So like say milfoil will be in ponds elsewhere where there might be fish that are herbivores and will eat the plant. And they also are species have evolved with other species with them that might be able to compete better for light and space. And so they have adapted to coexist.
Yeah, I think that's the big one. Is some of the I mentioned one study that said 84% less fungal pathogens impact invasive plants in their new habitat. And that is a huge release of like a limiting factor on a plant. Yeah. You might not think a plant that evolved on the other side of the planet would be better adapted to this new environment, but because of those the enemy release hypothesis, they call it, that's why they appear to have all these other just they're doing better. I had a question about the spiny flea and fishing and consuming fish. Is it a human hazard concern? It can puncture their
That's
body parts,
that's
but
a
I don't know.
That's a good question. I think that if you're consuming fish, generally all the guts and stuff are removed, and you're not really eating. You know, when the that tail, the silica tail goes down, it generally gets stuck in their gills or their throat area, and then it might puncture the other organs. And um, I don't think any of us really eat any of those organs. But
Or
it's a
no.
good question. I can
Yeah,
look into it,
yeah,
Mike, and
yeah.
shoot you an email if I find anything out.
Definitely love all the information. And also, if either of you have anything that you'd love to share with everybody, please feel free to send it to us. And the more information we have, the better. On the same vein, do deer and other wildlife browse any of these invasives? Another broad one.
Yeah, unfortunately, they browse what seems like the things we want a lot, like our oak seedlings, and they don't browse. I've seen buckthorn browse, but it's not very common. Yeah.
Another one, how realistic is it to prevent, eradicate, or control an invasive species in an individual community if surrounding communities have already been overcome?
Yeah, I mean, we call it picking our battles, right? And it's really challenging when you can put all this effort into your whatever your square is. Maybe you have 6 acres and you want to get rid of a plant, but if we don't work across property boundaries and on the landscape scale, it can be a little bit of an uphill battle, right? So yeah, I often stress that people should look at areas of their forest land that have very little invasives, and there may be areas that are really overrun with invasives, and you want to run in and tackle that, right? But the areas that have few, you can put a lot less energy towards and create a big impact by keeping something that's relatively intact still intact. Yeah.
I've definitely found that invasion curve that you shared very helpful uh, as a graphical reminder of how invasions work.
Mm.
Thank you so much for that. Um,
Laura, can I add in terms of aquatic environments? I
yes.
think that like Mike said, if you have one that already is overrun, you really are thinking, you want to think about those species that haven't yet gotten to the water bodies. So, like Newfound Lake, they are pristine except for the spiny water flea, but they are on the lookout all the time for any new plant. And I think they did have at some point milfoil in there, but it was at such a small density, and they caught it so early in time that they haven't had it again. They were able to remove it, they check, and they don't have it again. So that's like that's a win. So that's why it's important for people to be aware and educated and kind of share the information so that, as many people can be observing and noticing these things, then we can hopefully get to it soon enough to be able to remove them from the ecosystem.
Really glad to hear that Newfound Lake has had that luck, and I hope it keeps on going. Another one, this is more of a one for Mike. How soon do you need to treat a stump after cutting for efficacy?
That's a good question. I'd say it depends. If you're using a water-based, like glyphosate or triclopyramine, those are water-based herbicides where you mix water. You want to do it like within an hour. If you use an oil base, then it's going to penetrate a little bit easier. You can do it later. But I have seen people do some forest management and then come back a year later and recut stumps, just like when you do fresh cut your Christmas tree stem, and so you can do that too. So you can, if you're delayed, you can get the chainsaw out and recut them, or hand pruners or whatever it might be. Yeah, timing's important though. You really want to be late summer into the fall so that that plant is pulling that material downward.
Guess that's a good thing to think about as we start getting into the spring and start seeing things leaf out.
A great time to monitor for invasives of that phenology when many of these invasive shrub species are leafing out 2 to 3 weeks before our native plants, and also in October you can see green things into the fall, and when everything else is changing color, helps identify where they are.
Can you talk about some of the more ecologically friendly non-herbicide options for control, like grazing goats or prescribed fire?
Yeah, so those are both, I would call, like mechanical, and I think goats can be really effective at mechanical treatment, but they also are not selective, and they're going to graze everything. So that site may be more ripe for those invasives to just sort of win back if those goats are then removed from that site, So just as far as managing vegetation and fire as well, it doesn't burn deep into the soil generally. It's, prescribed fire is a quick burning fire. So you may not kill seed sources or roots and things like that. So it does give you a little bit of control, but it's temporary, I think. Cutting can make things worse, but you can also try to commit to cutting. So one of the ones we'll hear about next week with Wendy is bittersweet. And if cutting it once a year is really bad, but if you cut it 7, 8, 9, 10 times a year, you could start to wear that plant down. But it's challenging.
Another one, how realistic is it? Oh, sorry, we already did that one. Are these invasive populations cyclical? I remember seeing large populations of purple loosestrife 20 plus years ago and have not seen many lately. Is it more common in southern areas of the state versus the northern?
I know I discussed purple loosestrife. However, I am not an expert on that one. We don't have it around, or I haven't seen it around here. I do remember my grandmother talking about it when I was, an intern here. So I'm not sure. Mike, do you know about that?
I'll just add that, yeah, there is, purple loosestrife is one example of a really good biological control that's been effective. There are these beetles called Laricobius beetles that were released in some sites that have been really effective. They just eat loosestrife. So statewide, I don't think it's is managing our loosestrife statewide, but where there have been some really large populations of it, it's done a really good job. that's really the best option, right? Is to find something with enough research that's not going to cause another problem, that's going to eliminate a need for mechanical and chemical and all this, and restore some sort of balance, right? Take that enemy release I talked about, and then restore it with some predator, right? Whether it's a fungus or a beetle or something. So
and
Sorry.
just adding on to that biological control, I know that there is a caddisfly that is effective for the uh, Eurasian milfoil, but not the variable milfoil. But yeah, I mean, just in there has to be a lot of studies. There are some pretty. You don't want to let an enemy on the loose that you're not sure that might get our native species as well.
yeah.
Okay. Kind of jumping off of that, are some of these invasives beneficial for native wildlife as a food source? I know that you mentioned that often they aren't browsed as heavily or grazed as heavily, but
Yeah, so they might not browse the foliage, but the fruit and seeds, I've there's some misnomers out there that they are not good for birds or wildlife, but they have different levels of proteins and fats, and they're definitely utilized heavily by wildlife. And unfortunately, before we knew better, we introduced many of them as beneficial wildlife plants. So as bad as something like bittersweet is, it's producing a lot of really persistent fruit. That's a great food source for a lot of birds, which is adds to the problem of why we see it everywhere. And sometimes our invasive habitats are uh, they may be lacking things we want, like native vegetation, but when it comes to like New England cottontails, multiflora rose thickets are their best protection. They need that thick plant layer. And before we go in and decide all the invasive plants are terrible and remove them, we need to think carefully, like, is that the only habitat in this site? Some places are heavily disturbed and heavily invaded, and it might not be reasonable to get native plants back there. So if we remove all the invasive plants, we may just be diminishing the habitat. So it's challenging, right?
And in terms of the aquatics, I think the reason why we see them thrive is because there are no fish that really predate on them, and they can become such pervasive monocultures and create such dense mats that it really is detrimental to the ecosystem as a whole.
wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn
Great
it back
questions.
over to
Yeah.
Janae because I think that we are out of time.
Yes, it is 6:05, so it is our cutoff time. For any of the questions that we weren't able to get to, or if you have any other questions you want to ask them, just put them in the chat and we will send an email to them, get their responses, and then send them to you guys for any remaining questions. But we just want to thank everyone for coming, and thank you to Pollyanna and Mike for being able to do the presentations. And with that, you are all good to go.
Thank you.
Thank you.